I'm photographer David duChemin, and this is Vision is Better, a sometimes weekly podcast about the craft and art of photography. Welcome here. Hey, welcome to another episode of Vision is Better. This is a special episode. I'm calling it After the Camera Live-ish, and it's in support of a resource I released about 2 weeks ago now called After the Camera. This is my vision-driven approach to editing and post-production, and one of the things I asked people that had that were part of my audience and that had purchased the resources, if you have questions, if you would like to see how I would maybe develop one of your photographs, send it in. And so I won't do a lot of these, but I'll do a couple of them. And in this episode, I'm looking at a photograph by Stephen James Martin, and this is a photograph made of hot air balloons over Bagan. And I would do a couple of things with this photograph. As you know, if you're working through the material, the first step in the vision-driven workflow is to identify your intent. So before you start pushing buttons and sliders around, just ask yourself, what is it that I want from this photograph? And one of the first things that I see in this photograph is the potential for some mystery and a real feeling of kind of tropicality. There's some fog, low-lying mist hanging out over the trees and the temples. This is a raw file, not particularly easy to see some of those details, but they will be when we pull them out and we adjust some of the color temperature. I'm not a big fan of the HDR look, as many of you know, and so I'm not going to do some crazy HDR type of treatment, but I am going to bring out some of the foreground so that you can see some of that really beautiful detail in the mist and the mystery. So there's a bit of a weakness with this photograph, and that is just that it's a little bit soft. But for the sake of showing you how I would treat this, I think there's lots of potential here. So the first step, again, in the vision-driven workflow is identifying your intent. We've talked about that. I'm going to try to bring out some of that mist, that mystery, the feeling of tropicality. Although Bagan is not technically, I don't think, what I would consider the tropics, like oceanside. There is that sort of moistness in the air. Second step is to minimize the distractions and kind of clean up the canvas. Everything looks pretty good here. The horizon looks straight-ish, but I did notice when I was poking around the file ahead of time, just sort of looking for some of these things, is that there are some dust spots. So pressing the A key will get me to the spot removal tools, visualize spots mask, and I am just going to go through a couple of these and get rid of those just to clean up the canvas. And Stephen, you might just want to clean your sensor when you get around to it. So, but who doesn't need to, right? So I think that's pretty good. Just sort of in general, cleaning that up. Later on, something might pop out at us as we develop it. But for now, I think that's pretty good. So hitting the A key will get me out of that. I'm going to close out of that. Looking at the histogram, there's a little bit of room to move. You're a little bit underexposed in terms of it being an ideal histogram, but I think that's all right. I could push the histogram out a little bit with by adding some exposure, but I don't. If I add exposure to the entire image, I'm going to gain a much brighter image. I'm going to gain more detail in that foreground. The problem is I'm going to lose the mood in the sky, and I like the mood in this image. This is one of those photographs that has a lot of potential for mood. So what I'm going to do instead is go into, and I may also bump the exposure a little bit. I will do that later when I kind of check it out and make sure everything's kind of groovy. But for now, I'm just going to go into the graduated filter, and I'm going to draw a grad filter from the bottom up. I'm going to push the exposure probably about a stop. As I said, I'm not a big fan of that HDR look, so I'm not going to go, overboard. I'm going to zero that saturation slider. I'm going to push a little bit of clarity because I find clarity kind of pushes. See how the fog, if I go overboard, it starts looking nasty, but a boost of clarity kind of increases that mid-tone contrast and therefore makes the fog a little bit easier to see. And then I'm going to close out of that. And now the big thing I want to do two big things on this image. I want to play with the white balance to maximize or establish the mood. So I'm going to go and just try out the presets on cloudy, because cloudy often it will always warm things up. Shady will usually, or shade will often go a step beyond what I'm looking for. So in this case, that I think shade is a little more than realistic. Cloudy is not too bad. I would play with that. I would bump the clarity overall just a little bit just to see how it goes. And I rarely go much more than 20s or 30s. On a very rare image, I will push it even further than that. The next thing I want to try is, I'm going to skip the tone curve because there's plenty of contrast here. I don't want this to be a super bright image. I also don't want it too much contrast on a morning where you have a lot of fog. Typically, that's not like a super high contrast morning, so I don't want to introduce that because, again, it's going to get me a little closer to that HDR aesthetic, which is not a favorite of mine. But I do want to try the split toning and bring some greens into the shadows, or at least see what it looks like. So for split toning, in order to sort of get a sense of what kind of hue I'm looking at, you have to crank the saturation up a little first. Then I'm going to go until I get something that's in the greens, and then I'm going to dial the saturation back down maybe to 12. Now, as I've been working on the photograph, one of the things that has popped out at me is the brightness of this bottom this bottom left corner, and I think the easiest way to do that would simply be to unlock the aspect ratio in the crop tool, which you get to by pressing R, and then just bring this up a little bit so that now my foreground is nice and clean and doesn't have a hot spot. If I did that and I then felt that that was throwing the balance off, that made the foreground too small, it cut out too much of the frame that I wanted there, I could of course go in with another graduated filter because we lightened that bottom part of the image up so much. I could go in with a smaller graduated filter and darken that, or I could go in with the adjustment brush, or potentially even a radial filter and just darken that up to keep the visual mass down. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this palette on the side, and I'm going to take a look at this against a white background. I will often also, as I did in the last episode, will also go to the print module and just see it against a a white backdrop, just to see kind of if that, once that's printed, if that gives me the kind of the look that that I want. And I like this because it's got the nice dark, very black pattern here. I think that's the strength of this photograph, is this beautiful kind of shape here. I like that a lot. It's not too high contrasty. It's not unbelievably warm, I don't think. But I might now go back and just budge the overall exposure just a little bit. Go back to the print module. So I've only budged it by 0.3, but that to me is a much nicer looking photograph. It has more mood. I don't think you need a lot of dodging and burning, although we've done some, sort of drawing in the eye with our graduated filter at the lower side of the bottom of the frame. So I'm going to just quickly go back to the develop module, and I'm going to hit the keystroke Y to show you before and after. So if I were doing this on my own image and not explaining it as I went, this would probably have taken a minute and a half to tweak, and would have got me to a point where I think the mood of the image is better. I think some of the distractions in terms of the little sensor spots and the bright hot spot on the bottom left of the image is reduced, and so the visual mass is kind of reassigned to the photograph, and the balance is you're not distracted by hot spots and little bits and pieces. And with that split toning, by bringing a little bit of green into the shadows, it might not be your thing, Stephen, but to my eye, this gives, without it seeming, like that very popular 500px landscape kind of look that's a little overly saturated. We haven't given any more saturation to this image. All we've done, or any more contrast, all we've done is we have given a little more contrast, but that was mid-tone contrast with the clarity, and we didn't do that much of it. All we really did was we tweaked the color temperature and gave a little bit more visual mass to the bottom third of the frame, so that you could see some of the details. You could see the temples a little bit better. You could see and feel the mist a little bit better. So relatively simple treatment, but would this look good in black and white? I don't think so, because the key to a great black and white photograph is tonal contrast. There's not a lot of tonal contrast here, but there's some lovely complementary colors, and the color palette is lovely. So that's one of the reasons I kept it in color and did a treatment that would accentuate that, would maximize the mood through the use of color. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. If this is the kind of thing that you're looking for and this is new to you, you can go to craftandvision.com and look for After the Camera. It's a 20-episode video series teaching my approach to vision-driven editing and workflow post-production in Adobe Lightroom. And we'll see you next time. Remember, gear is good, but vision's better. Take care.